Good morning, everybody. This is Daniel Blackburn. We are here with a new lecture of SWAE3411 Environmental Soil Microbiology. And today we're going to talk about the carbon cycle, especially from the microbiology point of view. So, carbon cycle is a very controversial topic because of climate change, mainly. We have that there's a human activity is contributing heavily for the emission of carbon to the atmosphere. And the emission of carbon to the atmosphere is leading the process of global warming. And it means that there is a greenhouse effect, that the heat from the sun is trapped in the atmosphere, and therefore the global temperatures are rising. So here are some of the main contributors for this increased carbon emission. One is the use of fossil fuel in the production of cement. And we have land use change also, the contribution of agriculture. And also we can have some of this carbon coming from the ocean due to the heating of the ocean. But what is a biogeochemical cycle? We're going to talk about the biogeochemical cycle of carbon and the contribution of microbes on this cycle. But what is a biogeochemical cycle? A biogeochemical cycle is the complete path that a given chemical can take through the four spheres of Earth, the reservoirs. So we're talking about the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere and biosphere. So atmosphere is the air, hydrosphere, we're talking about bodies of water. The lithosphere is the rocks and soils, and the biosphere is we're talking about plants, animals, and microbes. Plants, animals, and microbes. The biosphere, the bio is meaning it belongs to life. So the understanding of these biochemical cycles also brings us the understanding of how we are influencing these cycles, and negatively or positively, and how we can manipulate or foresee any shortages or any downsides of what we different pools on the planet. And this is very important for us, especially in all the things that we use or that affect us simultaneously. So if we don't know exactly how big are the pools and how much they're moving in between these pools, we might imbalance these cycles in a way that is detrimental for human life. Also, we have to consider that anything we are doing is also affecting the natural world and also the ecology of different parts of the planet. So why carbon? Why carbon is the basis of life? So carbon is a very special element. And what makes it special is that it forms four covalent bonds, and it makes carbon to carbon bonds, which results in having very large carbon molecules, which at the same time are very flexible. The carbon to carbon molecules are quite flexible, and therefore all these organic materials can have quite a lot of dynamic and flexibility in different shapes in the environment. Also, carbon makes a huge amount of different links and bonds to other types of elements, and the diversity of these structures can be very rich and very complex. There's some speculation that other elements that have similar chemical behavior could also be the basis of life, like silicon. But of course, this did not happen. This is in our planet, carbon is the basis of life. but we want to talk about the carbon in the environment and how different microbes are affecting the movement of this of different procedures or pathways that this carbon is taking on the environment. So the carbon cycle is very characteristic because it's heavily influenced by microbes. Here is a good representation of the carbon cycle from the microbiology point of view. On the right side, you have all the aerobic processes. And then in the left side, you have all the anaerobic processes. So first of all, we have the autotrophs, which are fixing CO2 from the atmosphere. And you have this autotrophy happening both on the aerobic side, fixing CO2, and also in the anaerobic side. So this is autotrophy. The main example for that is photosynthesis, but not necessarily photosynthesis. We have chemolithotrophy also in different autotrophic pathways that can be happening from the microbial side. The heterotrophs are the ones that are releasing the carbon back to the atmosphere, and they are using the organic matter as a source of energy, as a source of carbon, sorry. And this can happen also on the aerobic side and then also in the anaerobic side. So in the aerobic side, we have the aerobic respiration. In the anaerobic side, we have anaerobic respiration and fermentation. So on the anaerobic side, we have a very specific process that is happening, which is called the methanogenesis. The methanogenesis is an exclusive process from archaea, and we have two main pathways. One is when it's a chemolithotrophic process, which is using CO2 to form methane, and also autotrophic process. But also we have the methylotrophic methanogens, which are using products of the fermentation process to generate methane. And of course, this methane will not stay as methane forever. It can be oxidized back into CO2 by some microbes that are called methanotrophs. So in order to understand the carbon cycle, we have to understand there are several different pools of carbon on the environment, and these different pools, they move between each other, and microbes are influencing this movement quite heavily in every sense. The larger reservoir of carbon in the earth is carbonate rocks, yeah? But there's many others smaller reservoirs which also can be quite large if you think in the total amount. So when you think about carbon in the atmosphere, the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere is quite low comparing to the amount of carbon that is present in other pools. In the atmosphere, we have about 600 gigatons. In the oceans, we have 1,000 gigatons. In the biosphere, 600 gigatons. In soils, 1,800 gigatons. Fossil fuels account for 5,000 gigatons. Deep oceans for 38,000 gigatons. Continents for 6.5 times 10 to the 7 gigatons. The mantle, 3 times 10 to the 8 gigatons, and the Earth core, 4 times 10 to the 9 gigatons. So it means that in rocks and in the mantles and in the Earth core, it's where the higher amount of carbon is present. Yeah? Nevertheless, we are more concerned about what is happening in between atmosphere, oceans, biosphere, and the pedosphere. Here is a simplified version of what is happening between the movement between these different pools. Carbon is usually fixed from the atmosphere into the waters and soils through photosynthesis or autotrophy. and is also released back to the atmosphere by respiration. And so there's this interchange between earth and water systems and the atmosphere through autotrophy and respiration. But we are, of course, interfering in that also by burning fossil fuels. And there is a natural chemical processes happening also, the dissolution of CO2 in water, forming carbonic acids, and these carbonic acids precipitate in as carbonates. And there is, of course, chemistry, not only biochemistry involved in this, but there is quite a lot happening through the microbes in these systems. So we're going to try to explain a little bit more how the microbes are influencing these cycles. In the non-living environment, we talk about the main chemical forms that we find on the non-living environment. In the atmosphere, we have carbon dioxide and methane. In water systems, we have carbonic acid, which is just CO2 dissolved in water. We have the limestones and corals, which are precipitated calcium carbonate. And we have all the living beings, dead organic matter, that is what we usually talk about as fossil fuels. Fossil fuels like the oil or coal, they're long dead organic material, living beings. Also, soil organic matter and frozen soil organic matter like permafrost, they are very important pools of carbon on the environment. So how this carbon is released into the atmosphere, there are several pathways. The main pathway is the respiration of carbon by the microbes. The microbes are using organic matter as a source of carbon and as a source of energy. And these heterotrophs, they are using this carbon and releasing CO2 into the atmosphere in this process. Okay, and this is you can think about that like the natural decay of organic materials, either plant or animal materials, but also the combustion of organic material, either recently living organic material or long dead organic material, is one big source of CO2 for the atmosphere. The production of cement also it's a huge source of CO2 for the atmosphere. And of course, we can use the microbiology to reduce this emission by using microbially induced calcite precipitation instead of cement. And that will be a good help for lowering the carbon emissions to the atmosphere. We're going to talk a little bit about microbially induced calcite precipitation in a bit. Also, the ocean can release CO2 in the atmosphere when it's heated up, or there is some pH changes that can lead to more CO2 release into the atmosphere. There is an equilibrium between the CO2 in the atmosphere and the carbonic acid dissolved in water systems. The next big source of carbon emission is volcanic eruptions, and So carbon is taken from the atmosphere in several pathways. The main way is through photosynthesis, but also we don't want to limit photosynthesis as the only way to describing the carbon fixation by living beings. We usually put it in broader terms and talk about it as autotrophy. The autotrophy is the process in which living beings take CO2 and use the CO2 as a source of carbon to make the organic molecules they need for living. Among these autotrophic processes, we have photosynthesis, but also we have chemolithotrophic microbes, which are older and quite important also in these ecosystems. Oh, the oceans can be also a sink from CO2 if we have if you cool down the waters, they will take more CO2 dissolved as carbonic acid. Also, this dissolved CO2 can become precipitated as carbonates, or can be used by living beings in these waters and can become a sink of carbon in waters. The main forms of atmospheric carbon are carbon dioxide and methane. So carbon dioxide is the CO2 that we usually speak, and the concentration of CO2 during the last years have strongly increased from, it was about 208 ppm 50 years ago, and now we have more than 400 ppm on the atmosphere currently, about 407, 410 ppm. We should expect, I would guess, that during this COVID crisis we have some decrease of the atmospheric concentration of CO2 because the human activity has drastically been reduced during this period. So we still have to see how much is going to impact on the carbon cycle. But for now, we can just say that it's over 400 ppm. And this strong increase, of course, is the main source of the greenhouse effect and the increase in temperature of the planet. So the main form of release of CO2 is by cellular respiration. Okay, so methane accounts for a much lower concentration on the atmosphere. It's between 0.72 to 1.8 ppm. This is not correct. Yes, this is correct. Yeah, this is correct. Okay, so this is much lower than the 400 ppm of CO2, but the reason we care so much about methane is also it causes a much stronger greenhouse effect. So the potential for causing global warming is 25 times higher than it is of the CO2. So methane is considered as an air pollutant. Yeah, because of this. The source of atmospheric methane, about 10 to 30% of the production of methane is natural. In a way, we can say that it would happen anyway if humans were not here. So if we look at the natural processes, the wetlands are the main source of these natural emissions of methane, but also, for example, termites could be contributing heavily for this. But in the human side, we have the burning of biomass. You have animal production because the methane will be produced inside the intestine of cows, for example. This will occur naturally, but of course the human activity is drastically increasing this. The use of landfills also creates anaerobic conditions where this anaerobic degradation of organic matter creates a huge emission of methane. The exploitation of natural gas and coal also releases trapped methane on the Earth systems. And agricultural activities such as rice production also is a big source of the emission of methane. So that accounts for about over 70% of all the methane emissions globally. The methane is emitted by a specific group of microbes. So the methanogens, they are all archaea. So this archaea is a key microbe on the carbon cycle because of the group of methanogens. These are highly anaerobic microbes, which means that any small concentration of oxygen can be deadly to them, which also is one of the reasons that make them very hard to culture. Also they are present throughout ecosystem whenever you have anaerobic conditions. It could be in digestive systems of animals, or it can be on the sediments of lakes and water bodies. And also anaerobic digesters, and any conditions at all when you have high organic matter and low oxygen. That's where you're going to find quite a lot of methanogens. Yeah? And you can, if you have more methanogens happening, this is automatically an indication that your soil has some anaerobic conditions. We have two types of methanogens. We have chemolithotrophic methanogens. We have methyllotrophic methanogens. The chemolithotrophic are the ones that are using CO2 from the atmosphere and producing methane from CO2, and this is very special energy and carbon metabolism, first described by Sergei Wingradsky also. Normally, the final acceptor of electrons are carbonates in this system. And also we have methylotrophic methanogens, which used methanol, methylamines, acetate as a substrate for this reaction to produce the methane. This is both of them are doing this process to use it as a source of energy. Both processes are reducing, reducing the carbon, and therefore you need highly anaerobic conditions for this to be happening. We have 5 orders of methyllotrophic methanogens, and these are the ones here described. Methanobacterialis, we have methanococcalis, and this other here, which corresponding to and encompassing 26 genera of archaea. These methanogenic microbes, they are highly useful for the production of biogas or in the sewage treatment. So all the bioreactors that are producing biogas, they are highly dependent on the culturing of the naturally occurring methanogens archaea. The methane is then oxidized back into CO2 by a group of microbes which are called methanotrophs. Methanotrophs because they grow on methane. So methanotrophic microbes are the ones that are oxidizing methane back into CO2 and releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere. Yeah, these microbes they have some very specific membrane structures where we have a very interesting enzyme which is called methane monoxygenase. And the methane in this case is a source of energy and carbon for these microbes. So to talk a little bit about organic matter, it's organic matter in soil. It's a very broad term. We have so many different types of organic materials in soil, and they have different a different capacity, or let's say they are not as easy to degrade as each other. You know, they have a range of different recalcitrants. They have a range of different liability to be decomposed. Some are more complex and hard to degrade. Some are easier. Some are older and more stabilized in soil. Some of them will be more fresh, coming from the organic matter. So the autotrophs, like plants, will be deposing fresh organic matter, plant debris in the soils, and microbes will be using this carbon as a source of carbon and energy during respiration. And the product of this degradation will be the most recalcitrant carbon, which will be transformed during this process, and this is what we call soil humus. So humus is also a broad term which relates to non-living, stabilized a product of degradation of the fresh organic matter by microbes. And this is very important in soils because it is a soil conditioner. It improves soil quality in many ways. It improves the chemical and physical properties of the soil, improves water infiltration, water retention, improves the cation and anion exchange capacity of these soils, and also it's a reservoir of nutrients for plants. So, and all of this makes the soil humus a very important component of soils. In the production of soil humus by microbes, it's a very essential process for the quality of agricultural soils. So soil organic matter is composed of animal residues, and animal residues also in different stages of decomposition. Soil organic matter it's composed about 50% of carbon, but also a lot of oxygen and hydrogen. And the process of decomposition of the fresh organic matter into humus is what we call mineralization, or of the fresh organic matter. Yeah, and it's done by soil heterotrophs. So the organic matter from plants, the plant materials, they have the different types of chemical carbon compounds from plant materials. Some are more recalcitrant, some are less recalcitrant. So the main different components of organic matter on carbon-based molecules, we have cellulose accounting for 45% of this dry matter, hemicellulose 18%, lignin 20%, proteins accounting for 8%, sugars 5%, fats, waxes 2%, and polyphenols 2%. So some of them, this material, as I was talking before, are easier to decompose by microbes, and some are harder. So sugars, starch, and simple proteins, they have a very rapid decomposition in soil. Crude proteins a little bit slower, and then hemicellulose, cellulose, fats, and lignins will have a very slow decomposition in soils. So the easier it is for degrading these materials, it means that these materials are a good source of carbon and energy for soil microbes. If these materials are hard to degrade, it means that these materials are a good source of soil humus. They will be transformed later on into soil humus. So the composition of plant and animal materials will be releasing CO2, but also nutrients such as ammonium and sulfate. Will be generating more microbial biomass and will be producing humus on these systems. One of the things we have to say about how easy it is to decompose carbon sources in soil, one of the things we have to consider is the stoichiometric ratio between carbon and nitrogen. So when we have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, it means we have too much carbon, and this material will be very hard to use by microbes. If we have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, it means that we have a good proportion of nitrogen in the material, and therefore the microbes will have a easier time degrading this material. So the threshold that we usually talk about is about 25:1. Below that is an easily degradable compound. Above that, above 30:1, we say it's not as easy to degrade by soil microbes. It's more recalcitrant. So when you add these plant materials to soil, you have to consider how high is the carbon to nitrogen ratio, because if you have that the carbon to nitrogen ratio is very high, it will mean that these this degradation will be very slow, and it will also deplete the soil nitrogen in this process. So again, the fast degrading microbes, sugar, starches, and proteins, they're rapidly degraded mainly by bacteria. The slower materials like hemicellulose, cellulose, fats, and lignin, they're be degraded mainly by fungi on these systems. So fungi will have the enzymes, the extracellular enzymes that will slowly degrade these more recalcitrant carbon materials in soil. So re-emphasizing the importance of carbon to nitrogen ratio, if you have below 25:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, we have a good amount of nitrogen for the microbes, and then that results in a quicker decomposition of the carbon. If we have that the carbon to nitrogen ratio is high, over 30:1, we have less nitrogen than the microbes need to degrade the organic matter to make more biomass, and therefore there will be a need for more nitrogen in order to speed up this decomposition. The microbes will face nitrogen deficiency if the carbon to nitrogen ratio is too high. So the speed of decomposition of these organic materials will be lower. And these processes are highly influencing how much nitrogen is available to plants, because if you have the carbon to nitrogen ratio is high, then the microbes will deplete all the nitrogen in order to be degrading the carbon. So here is some of the carbon to nitrogen ratio of different materials. Sawdust, for example, which is made of wood, this has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 600, and so on and so forth in decreasing range. But if you look at the soil organisms, if you look at the soil organisms here, you will find that bacteria, for example, has carbon to nitrogen ratio of 5. Fungi will have carbon to nitrogen ratio of 6. Of 10. Actinomycetes, nematodes will have about 6. So prokaryotes will have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. Fungi will have a little bit higher, but all in all much lower than it is the carbon to nitrogen ratio of plant materials. So when it comes that these plant materials are released in soil, the microbes will grow and reproduce and make more cells, and these cells will have the carbon to nitrogen ratio that it has. It will not change the carbon to nitrogen ratio inside the cells, and therefore it will be consuming the carbon and nitrogen in this proportion, 5 times more carbon than it's consuming nitrogen. But because the organic matter that you're putting in soil will have 30 or 40, 50 times more carbon than nitrogen, then the microbes will deplete all the nitrogen first, and then the carbon will have to hold on and be degraded slowly while the nitrogen is being cycled in between the microbial cells. All right. So this is also, there is some carbon to nitrogen ratio of the organic matter in different types of horizons, for example. The average on a B horizon is 9, the average on an A horizon is approximately 20, and if you have a spodosol, for example, O horizon, it's about 90. So it's a more recalcitrant organic matter. So talking a little bit about the humus. The humus is what we know as a stabilized organic matter, which is the end product of degradation of soil organic matter by microbes. It's highly stable in soil. It takes many years to degrade, and composed mainly of carbon, about 58% of carbon, but also it contains oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, and many other elements also. And the importance of humus is that it's a conditioner of the soil quality. The more humus you have on the soil, the better chemical and physical properties you will have on these soils. The half-life of humans ranges from decades up to centuries, depending on how stable they are, and also how hot it is, the climate on the region, and how humid it is. Humus is also a microbial booster. Whenever you have more organic matter, you will have more microbial biomass and activity. It also increases the availability of nutrients. There's a nutrient reservoir. It's also improving the soil structure and the chemistry and physics of properties of these soils. There's no one specific structure for humans. They are a broad range of molecules. It's just a way of calling all the plant material that the organic matter that is stabilized in soil and it's resistant to degradation. So one of the other things we have to talk about humus is that humus it contains a lot of charges, as well as the clays, the charges in the humus. These functional groups, carboxyl, hydroxyl, and phenolic groups, they are acting as a cation exchange reservoir in the soil. So it's increasing the cation exchange capacity of the soils and therefore retaining these nutrients on the surface. These nutrients can be interchanged between the surface of these colloids and the soil solution, and therefore plants will have some access for these nutrients, and also by the depletion of the solution in the rhizosphere, then this humus material can then release these nutrients back into the solution and make them available to the plants. While the fresh organic matter, they are not acting as a chemical conditioning of the plant nutrition, but otherwise the decomposition of this fresh material, they are the source of the nutrients themselves that are released into the soil solution and stored in the colloids of the soil as the humus that we just spoke about. So freshly, easily decomposed organic matter, they are the source of nutrient during its mineralization, and the stabilized organic matter, they are the reservoir of these nutrients through the cation exchange processes. What happens if we add a fresh organic matter on the soil, or if we add something with high organic matter carbon to nitrogen content? It means that when we add fresh organic matter with high carbon to nitrogen content, it means it will deplete all the nitrogen on the soil. So this will be the nitrogen immobilization process. And if we add some material with high carbon to nitrogen content, low carbon to nitrogen content, it will be acting as a source of nitrogen rather as a sink of nitrogen in these systems. So this is the time course of development of nitrogen concentration after you add either high carbon to nitrogen ratio material or a low carbon to nitrogen ratio material in the soils. So coming back to the point of the climate change and how can we improve our footprint of carbon on the environment, the main ways we can do that is through not only personally, but what are the industrial activities, how we use our energy, how much we are reliant on fossil fuels, for example. But we can influence those industries by our preferences. If we consume things that are based on produced by industry that are pollutant, then we are influencing negatively this climate change. If we consume products that are from industry, they're green in that sense, they are not polluting the environment, then we are helping the environment. So many things are important. For example, the type of car that you drive, how much do you drive, how much energy and electricity do you consume, how much do you fly, use airplanes yearly. That makes a huge impact on your carbon footprint. The source of the food that you consume, if it's some for sustainable farming systems that are considering how much carbon footprint they have, or it's from unsustainable farming systems where they are emitting more carbon. If you consider that, that will be also a way of you helping reduce the emission of carbon to the atmosphere. And of course, we care about this because of global warming. Yeah, with the global warming is the worst case scenario. It means that we're going to have a lot of ice melting from Antarctica and permafrost, and all that will raise the sea level water, and then we will have a lot of problems on the coastal areas, such as Sib and Muscat, for example, will be heavily affected by rising levels of seawater. So this is also a very bad outcome. So everything we can do now to prevent this is a good thing. So one of the things that we can do, and it's involving microbes, is substitute the use of cement, which is one of the big source of CO2 to the atmosphere, and used instead of the cement, use a process which is called microbially induced calcite precipitation, which uses bacteria like some types of bacillus, for example, that produces urease. And the urease enzyme, if you have calcium chloride and you have carbonic acid on the system, and you have urea, then the reaction that this bacteria will cause will lead to the precipitation of calcium carbonate. And this calcium carbonate becomes, such as cement, a hard material. So instead of using cement, you can use the reaction from these bacteria to produce this concrete and use it to replace the cement. Will be very helpful to dealing with carbon emissions to the atmosphere. Also, the more you can promote plant life, especially of trees, which are a big reservoir of carbon in the biosphere. Use energy efficient vehicles and use fossil fuels the least, the better. Purchase locally grown food, reduce the use of electricity, take less trips in airplanes, and of course, always remember to reduce, reuse, and recycle. Thank you very much. This was all for today's lecture, and paste your comments and questions on the comment section of the Moodle website, or on the in the YouTube video, and I will answer your questions as soon as I can.